To take a look at this and other things, of course, and what's really the main thing is the first fortnight of Donald Trump's presidency, I'm joined in the studio today by former US State Department official William Jordan. William, great to have you back on the program. Where to start? Now, let's just take a look at what we heard there about those protests in Berkeley. It's right to say, I would believe, that what we saw there last night is only the beginning of a backlash against the new administration and some of its hard right support base. But there should also be a fear that these protests will feed into the rhetoric of the far right and claims that the so-called, it's the boogie word now, the liberals, are against free speech. How is that going to work?
Well, this is the long-running tactic of the far right, and it's always very ironic, given how little tolerance the far right has had when things have been reversed, and they've been trying to get their point of view across, and they feel like they've been excluded by either the mainstream media or by conventional politicians or however you want to describe them. I mean, I think that this is part of the, if I can put it this way, media strategy, or at least the all-out offensive that the Trump administration, from President Trump down, has launched against sort of mainstream voices, which, of course, I'm not sure they came into the new administration expecting to be on a war footing, but they were certainly coming in with a great deal of skepticism, as they should. All administrations should accept, whether they're Democratic or Republican, a certain amount of media skepticism, a certain amount of skepticism by the public, from whatever side. But as is typical of Donald Trump, who, let's remember, I mean, this is a name that may not mean a lot to your listeners, but somebody whose mentor was Roy Cohn, who was very close to Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s, who always told Trump the best way to defend yourself is to go on an extreme offensive and to anticipate.
Best form of defense is offense.
And I think to go even beyond sort of what that generally means, so that, and as has generally happened, so that you dominate the narrative and you are able to keep your opposition off balance, and you're constantly able, in a way, to define or redefine the terms of the discussion on more favorable terms to you than those who are criticizing.
Well, he's keeping, it seems, the entire world off balance. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of jitteriness out there because the man is so unpredictable. I mean, even on social media, whether you like Trump or whether you support him or whether you're against him, everybody is on tenterhooks about what will happen next. But you're saying there about, let's just say, basically that the best form of defense is offense. I mean, hit first. Is it right to say that Trump, however, is losing a lot of goodwill that a newly arrived president would normally expect? I mean, even we had de facto EU president Donald Tusk saying that the United States is now a threat to Europe, and is on the same list as Russia, the rise of right-wing populism in Europe, and terrorism.
All of which I would fully agree with. I mean, I think that the rest of the world needs to take, very clearly the message that it's time to be thinking about alternatives to a lot of the close, long-standing partnerships with the United States, and not to look at the United States as an inevitable enemy or as a country that needs to be fully marginalized, but to take into account that the old ways of doing business, and even the respect by the United States for a lot of the international architecture that it has created, is no longer something that people can rely on, or the United States to put at the forefront. That if it's going to be, as Trump said in his inaugural address, which was very much a campaign speech, much more so than the kind of call for a new rallying around the flag and around the country, a new, an evocation of a positive vision of a way forward. It was very much an apocalyptic.
It was downright churlish, I believe. I mean,
well, it was definitely confrontational, and it was making clear that it's going to be America first. It's going to be buy America. It's going to be hire American, and I think that this is carrying over into everything that the administration is doing, and I believe the administration is rushing as fast as it can to, this is a term that perhaps is inadvisable, it's often applied to the Israelis in terms of their settlement policy, but to create as many facts on the ground as quickly as possible, which is something that I expect once the congressional leadership gets its act together on the Republican side is going to be echoed by a lot of fast-moving legislation. The only thing that's sort of holding things up right now, in my view,
top brass,
is getting the cabinet secretaries in place and confirmed, and the Trump administration is running as fast as it can to outflank and to overwhelm its opposition.
Well, it seems that the world, and myself included, is trying to run to stand still, like literally to keep up with this. It's like it's a barrage in the past 2 weeks. Now, let's just look at, I mean, you were saying about the cabinet and the top brass within Trump's administration still yet it has to be ironed out. But let's look at any policy here. Now, the Israeli administration, you touched on Israel there, that the Israeli administration under Benjamin Netanyahu appears to be particularly emboldened by the arrival of Donald Trump. I mean, relations with Obama went from frosty to downright non-existent. Now, the illegal settlements in the West Bank are pressing ahead despite UN condemnation. And in the past 2 weeks, one has to ask, has there been any clear policy on the Palestinian two-state question coming out of Washington, apart from the fact that, hey, we're open for business?
Well, I think the clearest indication of where the administration wants to go is, of course, the move, which will be quite inflammatory, to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, I'm not 100% convinced that that's going to happen rapidly.
Is it plausible, though?
Oh, it's entirely plausible, and I don't know if it's still the same plot of land. I've been in Jerusalem. I've seen where the U.S. embassy is supposed to be built one day. But I don't know where all of that stands in terms of money that's been allocated or anything else. The new or the nominee for the new American ambassador in Israel is very much a staunch ally of groups that support settlement in the occupied territories. And I think that this question of finally making good on a long-standing set of legal obligations that Congress has imposed on presidents to move the embassy to Jerusalem and to recognize the entire city of Jerusalem as Israel's capital is something that is not going to just kind of be brushed aside or dealt with through the application of waivers as easily unless Secretary of State Tillerson, now that he's in, discusses this with his advisors and is prepared to take this back to the White House and say, no, you really can't do this.
Well, it's that kind of bluster and blundering through of the last 2 weeks that, we're almost becoming inured to it. Even today, the White House issued a cryptic warning that the U.S. will act against Iran unless it stops testing ballistic missiles, and that allegedly happened at the weekend. And also threw in there about supporting Houthi rebels in Yemen. But they declined to say exactly what actions the U.S. would take. Now, how would you view the wording of all this? Is it deliberately being vague?
Oh, it's absolutely deliberately vague. I think that this use by Mike Flynn, the National Security Advisor, of Iran is on notice, which means nothing, and he would not elaborate on what that means. It doesn't really take you very far substantively. For that matter, the U.S. administration had previously, by going to the United Nations after previous ballistic missile tests, was putting Iran on notice.
It's a very schoolmarmish phrase. It's almost like something on Little House on the Prairie, tapping the table. But
delivered by somebody who, through his, body language and everything else, was clearly not, approaching this as sort of a schoolmarm. He was approaching it as somebody who was meaning to use a veiled threat. And again, I think that. One of the interesting things that's happened at the same time that declaration by Mike Flynn came out was, of course, you had news about Donald Trump on the phone with the King of Saudi Arabia. And that is actually something that, personally alarms me, because what I see is the United States is falling right back into the trap that it has long been in, of continuing to favor relationships with strong men in the region and to favor sort of the Sunni side of the coin in order to be able to confront Iran.
Okay, well, Mom, I have to say, William, we're going to be running out of time here. A very quick question before I go, a one-word question. The what next factor has become the kind of status quo with leaving people in disarray, and many people quite afraid. Should we be afraid?
I think we should be afraid, but I don't think we should believe that the sky is falling. But this is going to be very alarming for a long time.
Okay, my thanks there to William Jordan.